Hello, I am Brian McWilliams from the Lions of Liberty and the Electric Liberty Land podcast, here to talk to you today about non-intended consequences of regulations and what we've forgotten since 1989. Now, of course, I'm coming from a very United States-centric perspective here, having been based in the United States for all of my life, but let's kick things off and see where this can take us. So obviously, when we talk about regulations, we think immediately of the most impactful regulations, at least in the United States, which oftentimes are economic, are financial. When we're talking about 1989, that makes me think immediately of the Financial Institutions Reform, Recovery, and Enforcement Act, which of course had created institutions like the FDIC, which is banking up most of the banks here in America. And people oftentimes associate the economic collapse of the housing bubble and subprime loans with regulatory reform, and oftentimes blame a lack of regulation on those things coming to fruition. So just right off the bat, I do want to talk about, people forget the impact of regulations and how these things do have such a waterfall effect on what happens within the economy and how people live and react. So getting back to this creation of the FDIC and also the creation of regulatory bodies based upon financial markets and based upon working within housing markets, et cetera, because banking and housing are so often intertwined because of the mortgages, et cetera. We have these regulatory bodies created, right? We have these banks that they're now dependent on the federal government in order to back up all of the loans that they are giving out there, right? The FDIC, the biggest banks, you have to have that FDIC banking because they limit how much money you can spend. They want to make sure that you are dependent on them to back up what's going on and to basically provide that insurance on your bank. That gives the federal government a certain amount of sway and a certain amount of power over what you can and can't do as a bank. Now, when we talk about the impact of that and how it comes to the subprime mortgage crisis and subsequent crash, which took out, a couple of the biggest banks, should have taken out all of them, too big to fail, as we'll all remember. We have to talk about the impact the government had in forcing the banks into taking those subprime loans. Oft overlooked is the fact that under the Clinton administration here in the United States, there was a huge emphasis on getting banks, getting Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, getting banks into giving loans to people that were considered underprivileged, minority communities that had not been, represented in the housing market to the extent that the Democratic leadership would like to that point. So what happened was that the federal government and the Department of Housing actually put pressure on banks to give loans to people that would not have qualified otherwise. They essentially said, hey, we want you to move ahead with these subprime loans. We want you to go ahead and give these loans out to people that you wouldn't normally qualify, and we will guarantee backing. This is why the Freddie Mays and the Freddie Macs got involved. Or Freddie Mac, yeah, I think I said that right. I always forget. So anywho, they put the emphasis on the banks giving out these loans, and they said, look, we got your back. Don't worry about it. So what do the banks do? Well, they've been given a mandate. They've been not so gently urged by these regulatory bodies to move forward with these loans. Predictably, it didn't work out well because when people can't pay the loans back, somebody's going to be on the hook for that. Naturally, our federal government decided they would be on the hook for that since they're the ones that caused it in the first place. But untold damage was done to these financial institutions that were forced into this. And now, of course, there was even more reason to regulate these banks after the government had already forced them in by virtue of the regulations they had put in years before. So we talk about regulations and this waterfall effect that they have. I gave you one example of the financial side of things, right, in regards to the way banking is handled. However, regulations as a whole do not benefit the consumer and do not benefit free markets really in any way, shape, or form. Now, the way I say this and the way I come at this is that typically when you have a regulation, it is not simply made out of, spun out of whole cloth by the government, right? They don't come out of it and say, okay, we've got our finest minds on this job. They're going to find out a way to make this thing work properly. They're going to make sure that everybody gets a fair shake here. What we see instead, more often than not, is regulations coming from lobbyists, coming from the very corporations that they're seeking to regulate. I mean, there's no better instance of this than, well, I'll give you two, one during COVID and one that's kind of an overarching trend over the past 5-10 years. The overarching trend happens to be within the technology industry. We have technology giants like Facebook, like Twitter, like Google that exist in the marketplace. And these bodies have been pulled in, these regulatory bodies are pulling in the technology markets, pulling in the technology entrepreneurs and sitting them down and saying, look, you're going to play ball with us. We're going to regulate, but we want you to help us, right? Which is why you have the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world demanding that basically big tech be regulated, that they want to be regulated. Now, this might sound like a crazy thing. Why would you want to be regulated? Well, the answer is very simple. Typically, people in government do not understand many of the things that they're regulating. I was just listening to a former Congressman, Justin Amash here, who he was libertarian before he left office. He has said very plainly that the people that are on the commissions, the regulatory boards, and the people that decide who actually gets to regulate what, and they're having all of these hearings, typically they're on those boards simply as a political favor. It's not any indication of their knowledge base. It's not indicative of their intelligence or their well-roundedness on any topic in particular. It is simply a benefit for being allegiant to a party, right? You're a good Democrat. Here, we're going to put you on the housing board. Oh, you're a good Republican. Here, we'll put you on the military-industrial complex board. You're on the Foreign Intelligence Committee. So the people that are often taking part in the regulation of these other companies have no idea what they're talking about. So they look to companies like Facebook. They bring in the Zuckerbergs. They bring in the, whatever, Jack Dorsey, the bearded nutball from Twitter. They bring these people in. They sit them down and they grill them over, right? It's typically mostly a political theater. And then they say, okay, what are we going to do for actual regulations? Well, they get help from those very companies. And those regulations often target smaller companies. Now, whether this is intentional or not, I would say definitely intentional. Whether it's intentional or not happens over and over again, because what ends up happening regardless is that anytime you introduce a new slate of regulations, you are putting a regulatory hurdle in place that will stop competitors from entering the market or force smaller competitors out of the market. If it doesn't fully force them out, it without a doubt will limit the amount of capacity they have, excess funds they have to invest in their own business again, or to go into R&D to develop something new to offer the public. How? Well, anytime we think about regulations, we're talking about legal hoops. So of course you have to have accountants, you have to have lawyers, you have to have specialists come in to aid you in making sure that you are regulatory compliant. So how is that going to impact the overall marketplace? Well, clearly, it's going to stifle entrepreneurship. Clearly, it's going to stifle people that are trying to get into a marketplace, because you might not have, you might have the greatest idea, right? You might have the idea that's going to change the world. Maybe you're the next Facebook. Maybe you're the next PayPal, whatever it might be. But now, just to get that off the ground, you have to bring in 3 different specialists. Not only that, but because of regulations demanding what has to go on in the workplace, what has to go on in regards to international compliance or national compliance, making sure that you have, and this one's becoming a special bugaboo here in the United States, making sure that you have the right racial hires, the right diversity groups. Let's say you have a company, right? A small company, emerging company that you want to have a board of directors on there, right? You need to bring in people that know industries, that can make those connections, that can take your company to the next level, or at least bring it to the point where it's going to be attractive enough to bring in large client bases. Maybe you're going to go public. Maybe you have an initial public offering that you want to do. Maybe it's a reverse merger. But you need to get people behind you that know what they're doing, or at least look like they know what they're doing, in order to get that support. Well, now, because of regulations that have put in place here in the United States, I know California, where I'm talking to you from currently, has a regulation on the books wherein you have to have a certain number of women on your board. So if you're a small company, you're a family business that's going out there. Now, it can't be you, it can't be Uncle Sal, and it can't be old Grandpa Jules over there. Now you have to bring in an outside party. Now you have to put mom on the board, or you have to bring in some outside person. So these regulations are going to make it far more difficult for you to get ahead and do whatever, achieve whatever goals that you're setting in place. Now, of course, the taxpayers, in regards to all this, also are getting a brunt of these regulations. Because no matter what, when you introduce new regulations, of course, you have a new regulatory body. Well, you have to make hires. You're not just shifting around people from inside the existing organizations. I mean, how can you take away from that, right? Our government's so efficient. You can't just move people around within it. What would they do? So you're adding on new taxpayer burdens. You're introducing a brand new army of regulators that are going to come in here that are not only going to tax to fund these regulators, but are also, of course, going to fine and fee. So not only do you have a new regulatory set of hoops to jump through, but you're also being fined at the same time. If you dare make a mistake, not only have you set yourself back by virtue of new regulations, but you're now also paying a fine, a fee, and also on top of that, again, to use California as an example, California has environmental regulations. So if you're trying to build out in an existing, I'll give you, this is a real life example from a client of mine. If you're trying to build, let's say, a visual effects facility, right? People that help with lights and magic, right? You're putting in characters and creatures and cars into movies. If you want to build a visual effects studio within an existing structure, all you're doing is adding desks, maybe moving some walls around. You have to bring in an environmental specialist, and you have to bring in the government's specialist to do an environmental impact report. How much does that cost? Well, I'll tell you, it's tens of thousands of dollars. And on top of that, you're also paying for rent, you're paying for the alterations you're already making, on top of another, on top of another, on top of another. So regulations are basically a knife cutting off the jugular for entrepreneurial business or just people that are looking to expand a current business. Now, another thing I want to mention is just when you remove regulations, how much faster things operate. We'll use COVID as an example. The United States currently is behind a lot of the curves of other nations on vaccines. Why? Well, it's very simple. Our FDA gets in the way. Now, we've provided some sort of measures in which, they call it a fast-tracked mode, wherein some of these drugs can be fast-tracked through. Some of them are getting to the front of the line faster than others. And having worked in that field a little bit, I can tell you that this is not unprecedented. There have been other fast-track applications for our FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, before. Typically, these are for orphan drugs or drugs that would appeal to a very small portion of the population that can't go through an elongated process to get approved because of the millions and millions of dollars it takes to get approved by the government to have this roll out. So the FDA has fast-tracked some vaccines, but of course, who's able to do that? Who's able to get these things fast-tracked? Who's able to make it happen? The largest companies. So not necessarily the best solutions, but the largest and the ones who are able to get things done the fastest are the Pfizers, are the Johnson & Johnsons. However, compared to Europe, we have a dearth of vaccines available to us because Europe's bodies have been able to move faster, have allowed more vaccines into the marketplace, whereas America has been slow to do that. One more thing I want to talk about too is just the effect this has. Think about the moral effect, the mental effect that regulations can have on you if you're a business owner or an entrepreneur. I mean, how many times have you sat around? And I'm sure there's a lot of you out here, if you're watching this, the Free Market Roadshow, you're obviously a free market, entrepreneurial minded person. Have you sat around, you have an idea, and then you think about everything that it would take to get that off the ground, all of the hurdles that you have to go through? You definitely are in danger the more regulations you put in place. And of course, the higher tax level, corporate tax is another problem. But again, I'm trying to stay on topic here. I tend to rant. You could get into a real why bother mentality, especially as we see the largest corporations continue to succeed, especially coming out of COVID, where you had a shutdown of smaller businesses while the largest businesses were able to continue to do business and succeed. So you literally had government, by virtue of, I guess, COVID regulations, health regulations, right, shut down giant swaths of small businesses, not able to compete, not able to acclimate to the current regulatory environment and the ever-changing precedent that was being set by the government bodies. So the biggest companies have grown exponentially. Amazon, Target, I'm not sure, what examples I could use over in Europe, but the largest companies, Aldi, there you go, there's one, point for me. The Aldis have exploded because these are big companies that are able to facilitate the changes needed. Meanwhile, small business takes it on the chin. Anybody thinking about starting a small business up in this past year probably decided not to, and probably decided they may never do it again because the government was able to not only delay, shut down their plans, but also because of the shutdown of economies over the world in this past year, the massive number of hits that they've taken there, with very few exceptions. Some of them may be the North countries there, or the Scandinavian countries, pardon me. because of those number of hits, these people may never be able to have that opportunity again. They might have to go through all of their savings again. And now, looking at the mountain of new regulations that have put into place here, they're never going to wade into that pool again. Now, another thing I want to talk about is just how regulations destroy wealth creation, right? I mean, the maw of the state regulatory bodies sucks so much of that excess money out of the system that there's clearly going to be less to go around, right? Every time a regulatory body steps in and finds somebody, every time you have to hire a new accountant, every time you have to hire, another law firm to do X number of paperwork, well, granted, that's creating a job, also is denying a growth opportunity and growth potential to businesses. I mean, we look at how much it would cost to bring in, let's say, 3 new people at a starting wage, as opposed to hiring on a specialist consultant that's going to go over and make sure you're regulatory compliant. Well, we're clearly just taking away an opportunity for 3 different people, right? 3 different people to create a new level of wealth for them and their families, might be able to have some upward mobility in their society, might be able to reach a new level as far as their housing, as far as maybe they can have another kid, whatever it might be. But you're eliminating the creation of wealth in individuals from the marketplace by virtue of forcing people into regulatory compliance instead. Obviously, we have a finite number of dollars that we can put into any business at any time, and this is going to suck that out of the pool and instead feed the monster that is government. Instead, as we know, government loves to increase its own size and scope. So the more the regulatory body gets money coming in, the more the regulatory body will want money coming in, the more it's incentivized to come in. Now, I can give you a very simple example of this. I know it's off the beaten track, but an example of incentive versus some of these bodies. We have had pretty much a plague of police infractions wherein these police departments could legally, in the United States, go through, stop somebody for an infraction, let's say a broken taillight, and then they would search their car. They'd make up some reason to go through and search their car. What they would do is then confiscate any money that they found in that car and then say that they had to keep that money. They'd have to impound the vehicle because they cited it as some sort of infraction. Possibly it was money laundering. Possibly they thought it was involved in a drug deal. Whatever it might be, they were able to keep that money, right? Confiscate that money and put it towards the city coffers, the police coffers, whatever it might be that they needed money for. Now, because this was legal and people could try to get that money back, because oftentimes you didn't have to have a court date find that these people were guilty, because once that money was taken by the police officers, they would then put it in this fund, right? People would go to court, try to get that money back, sue the state, sue the city, sue the police officers, whatever it might be. Half the time, they didn't have the money to continue the case. Half the time, it was thrown out. Half the time they said, okay, yes, you won the case, but then trying to get that money recouped was nigh impossible for these people. My point being, once the police, stations, the police unions started to realize this money was easily gotten by this method, once the states realized they could be a real revenue generator by virtue of confiscating this money, they started making sure that they did it more often. The police that would then seek out reasons to stop people. They would always go through and look for these large portions of money, or they would always find a reason to seize a car because it tangentially involved, maybe somebody had a small amount of marijuana, they would seize the car and then sell the car at auction. Seize a house that was involved. Maybe they raided a house because they thought someone was selling drugs out of it. They managed to find a small amount of whatever else, seize the house, sell it at auction. So you see my point, though, in that regulatory bodies, they are enticed to have the same thing. They're enticed to make that money back by fine and fee in order to continue the growth of the state, continue the growth of that body. Now, the other thing I want to talk about is just the cost increase that all these regulatory measures put onto the population, the basic consumers, not even taxpayers who are already paying for it. But on top of that, you're getting fined by virtue of these regulations in every purchase that you make. I'll give you a current world example, and that'll wrap up this little talk. And hopefully I haven't rambled too much about. But DoorDash, right? I believe that is universal at this point. Might be called something else, but DoorDash or what's another one? Uber Eats or anything, any service that brings you food by virtue of having some business sign up, right? A restaurant sign ups, your local everyday curry house signs up for DoorDash or signs up for this delivery service. You're able to access it on your phone. bop, 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 they bring it to your door, right? Now, it's not necessarily a great deal for these companies, but at least it's better than having to pay a full-time delivery driver. So a lot of them will go on with it, even though they'll complain about the cost. But what happens is that states and cities and all these different governments get involved. And we're seeing it on a city level and a state level here, at least in the United States. Cities and states get involved. City councils get involved. And they say, well, we don't think it's fair that DoorDash is charging this percentage on top for these restaurants, these poor restaurants, right, that have opted voluntarily to use this business and have other options. How could they charge that much? How dare DoorDash try to make a profit? So what do? Well, they go in, they tell DoorDash, well, you can't charge that much. We're gonna tack on a regulatory measure that demands that you don't charge as much here. So what is the result of that regulatory measure? Well, DoorDash isn't just going to take it on the chin. You know, they've already got probably a fairly thin margin for profit. So what are they going to do? Well, they're going to increase the prices for the consumer. And we're seeing that in what is really distinctly spelled out as a regulatory fee for DoorDash. I can read you this. I wrote it down just for you guys. To recoup what it considers lost revenue, DoorDash has tacked on another flat surcharge of $1 to $2.50, which it often calls a regulatory response fee. Now, this money goes straight to DoorDash. The drivers don't get a cut of that, right? As they might with the other process where it adds it on to the overall fee, right? Because before, the DoorDash price was built into the overall whatever it is, and you tipped on the total. Now, this fee is added on outside of that tip. This money goes straight to DoorDash. So thank you, government. Thank you, regulatory bodies, for making everything I order $2.50 more expensive. This is what regulatory bodies don't seem to understand when they try to do these things, but the big companies tend to understand, is that the big companies, number one, they understand that regulations are going to help them at the cost of their competitors and at the cost of consumers. They are not going to pay that cost. There is no company that exists anywhere that is going to simply take that cost and say, you know what, I'll eat that for you, Johnny Consumer, or government, you're right, we're making too much money. Allow me to make a little bit less money so that your regulations are taken care of. That's simply not realistic. Regulations always hurt the taxpayer. They always hurt consumers. And the free market is the only way in which we can easily solve this. Free market allows companies to fail. Free market allows companies to succeed by virtue of entrepreneurship, by coming up and offering a better price or a better service to undercut the biggest of us. And even when we talk about I'm not recording this whole thing again, so I'll just keep going. Even when we talk about companies coming in and being so large that governments want to break them up, right? They want to say that they're a monopoly. They want to say that they have too much power in the marketplace. Typically what we see, if we have a legitimate free market before regulations are able to strangle competition, what we see is typically the companies break up on their own, or the companies are undercut by upstarts. When you had IBM as such a monolith, it was undercut by Apple very quickly. By the way, before the regulatory bodies could get in, before they could say that it had an antitrust or monopoly suit, they had broken up. This has happened time and time again throughout history, but that is with a thriving free market. That is where you can have an entrepreneurial company start up, come in, undercut the competition, or provide a better service without having regulatory bodies stopping them from doing so. All right, hope you enjoyed that chat. I've been Brian McWilliams from the Lions of Liberty, and hopefully I will see you all sometime in person.